Continuing our coverage of the budget, joining us now from the nation's capital, where he's been contemplating the federal budget all day long, Lawrence Martin, author of Harperland and public affairs columnist with the Globe and Mail. Lawrence, good to see you again. How are you today?
Good, Steve. How are you?
Yeah, just terrific. Pretty interesting day. Let's start here. Governments, of course, make choices on Budget Day, and this government apparently chose not to indulge Jack Layton with all of the things on his list. Why do you think they did that?
Well, I think Stephen Harper had this planned all along, Steve. I think it's been a good day for him in that, you know, he wanted an election to happen, but he didn't want to be seen as the guy who was really pushing for it. And therefore, you had those marvelous strategic leaks yesterday saying that, you know, oh, we're meeting the NDP's demands quite a bit here. But when you saw the budget, in fact, it was only half a loaf there at best, and so the NDP couldn't really accept it. Stephen Harper wants the election. He's going to get it basically on his terms. He certainly didn't want to have it triggered on the contempt of Parliament motion. So, as I say, a good day for the Prime Minister.
We'll get into some of the strategizing about what went into his thinking in just a moment, but I want to focus on Jack Layton for a second, because even after all these many years, I'm always fascinated at how the conventional wisdom so often turns out to be wrong. And the conventional wisdom going into today was, of course Jack Layton's going to support the budget. His health is bad, he has too many seats at risk, and the government will no doubt toss him enough to enable him to vote yes. And none of that happened. Did that surprise you?
No, I mean, for Jack Layton to support a conservative budget is very difficult in the first place. For him to support Stephen Harper and the ethics of Stephen Harper and the corporate support from a Prime Minister like Stephen Harper, and the lack of support for the poor and all those things, the differences between the two parties that we know all about. In this case, it would have been too difficult for him to support the budget and then, you know, defeat the motion of confidence about contempt of Parliament and support the Prime Minister on that one as well. He would have been giving up too many party principles. So I expected him to really turn this budget down, given what the budget contained. And I think, you know, there's questions about his health, but I don't know, he looked pretty good today. He looked strong enough. And although the polling numbers are down a little bit for the NDP, they're not that bad. And I think he's envisaging a scenario in which the number of seats combined with the Liberal Party will be more than the number of seats that Stephen Harper wins, and that Jack Layton might be able to be part of a government in the future.
No, I hear what you're saying, but all of his recent pronouncements and the ads that he took out recently, and so much, it seemed to me anyway, so much of what he had been saying leading up to the budget was laying the groundwork for him to say, look, I'm the one guy here who's trying to make Parliament work, and if I do make Parliament work, look at what we can achieve for seniors. Yes, I know the government has some ethical issues, but we can still make this place work. That all ended today, and that didn't surprise you, eh?
Well, no. I mean, if Stephen Harper had come forward with more support for the five proposals that Jack Layton put before him, I think then Layton would have compromised, would have said, okay, this minority parliament is still working. But as I say, it was barely half a loaf there, and given that Layton didn't even come close to supporting it, as we saw in his speech in the mezzanine after the budget was put forward.
Now, you've always got to read the fine print here, and the fine print on his initial pronouncements after the budget was brought down was, the New Democratic Party cannot support this budget in its current form. What did you read into that?
Well, I read into that you know, if there were in fact major amendments put forward which would address his other demands, then perhaps a deal could be worked out. But Steve, there is no possibility of that. These amendments would have to be too major for the Prime Minister to consider. And so this election is on. It's signed, sealed, delivered. We're going.
Well, let me just follow up on that, because if the Bloc Québécois and the Liberal Party and the New Democratic Party all agree on amendments to this budget, could they not, since they have the majority of the seats among the three parties, could they not push them through?
No, I don't think it's going to reach that point. I don't think Michael Ignatieff wants to contemplate NDP amendments, nor does the Bloc. I mean, they wouldn't be able to agree on a package. They don't want to. The two other parties don't want to agree on a package. They're ready to fight this election, and I don't think there's any hope for a compromise.
Well, let me, at the risk of beating a dead horse here, try one more thing. Obviously, the government made a decision not to support the 5 principles that were on Jack Layton's list. There were also a set of principles on Gilles Ducep's list, and one of them was $2 billion in change, I guess, to help harmonize the sales tax in the province of Quebec. I guess there was a lot of talk again out of Ottawa that Mr. Flaherty might come up with something at the 11th hour to address that. Again, didn't happen. Any surprise to you there?
No, there was a lot of talk about that, and we thought that there might have been some movement toward it, but there was really nothing in the budget today that signified movement. And this was another indication that, as I said off the top, that Stephen Harper really wanted this election to happen. The polls are going well for him, but he didn't want to look like he was triggering it. He knows the public, you know, aren't really in the mood for an election, and therefore he didn't want to be seen to be the one pushing for it. But now he can say, you know, listen, I brought in a good budget. They didn't accept it. They don't want to keep the country on this, you know, this comfortable economic course I have it on in terms of recovery. And so I'm sorry, but we have to go to the polls.
Okay, help us with why it's, there are 2 reasons to call an election, if I understand this properly. One was you defeat the budget fails, the House is dissolved, you go to the polls on the defeat of the budget. The other was the Liberals are going to put this motion forward saying that the government has, you know, terrible ethics, and we want to have a vote of a lack of confidence in the government because of its bad ethics. It seems to me the Liberals would clearly rather fight the election on the ethical issue. The government would seem to be more happy to fight the issue on the budget issue. And yet, it's
right.
the budget issue on which we're going to the polls, according to you, and I guess according to everybody now. What, you know, did the Liberals blow this?
Another reason why, as I said, it's a good day for Prime Minister Harper. Certainly the Liberals would have preferred to go into an election having defeated the government on this very juicy sounding contempt for Parliament motion. Contempt being, you know, a very powerful word. But I suppose there's still a possibility that, you know, this motion could come up before the budget motion, and that we could get a little bit of a tango going here with both motions in play, and depending on which one, you know, actually is enacted first, I suppose there's still a possibility that, technically speaking, the contempt of Parliament motion could trigger the election before the for the budget motion. But, you know, the headlines are, the impression is going to be that the budget is, because it came first, the budget is the one that signed the deal here.
Well, that's what I'm wondering, because this is obviously a chess game played behind the scenes by a lot of smart people who, you know, think they understand what the trigger will be that will send us all to the polls. And at the moment, it certainly looks as if the trigger will be the budget. Now, surely the Liberals would have known that, and you know, I guess their vote on their motion will come up on Friday. So technically, that's before next week's vote on the budget. Does that mean we're going to the polls on the ethics stuff instead of the budget stuff? And does that matter at the end of the day?
Well, as I say, it's possible that the ethics motion might trigger it first. It's a little bit of an advantage for the Liberals because it's a stronger condemnation than arguing over the fine points of the budget for them. However, you know, as we're saying, the budget is the big news. It appears to be the initial trigger here. And, you know, Michael Ignatieff didn't really have a choice. He couldn't say, oh, I'm going to support the budget and then defeat them on the ethics motion. That would look a little bit pretzel-turny type of thing. So that's the way it's played out. Okay,
let's think about who actually wants an election right now. Clearly, from what you're telling us, you think the government does. You think that they're first in the polls, have been for a while, and are sitting on a comfortable piece of pavement right now. The conventional wisdom, again, is that the New Democrats are not, because while their polls are roughly where they've been, they lost that by-election in Winnipeg, and there's a lot of nervousness around the NDP quarters these days. The Bloc Québécois, they seem to be doing, you know, between 45 and 50 seats regardless, so they don't seem too nervous about it, which brings me to the Liberals. They've got 76 seats. How much uniformity do you believe there is in that caucus to go to the polls right now?
I think the uniformity is so-so. I mean, I think I've talked to some liberals who would say, who are telling me, listen, this abuse of power stuff is, this scandal and quasi-scandal stuff is really piling up. Let's give it a couple more months, you know, to sink into the public consciousness, and this can work better for us. That we don't have time to make this work because an election campaign is only 5 or 6 weeks away. So there's some hesitation there. There's some hesitation about, God, you know, we're pretty low in the polls to launch into any election campaign. But I think the majority in the caucus feel that it would have been for the party to bend over and support another conservative budget would have made their leader just look too weak at this time. And so it was, you know, most of them are with him and ready to go.
I get how optics are important in all this, but I wonder how many of those 76 Liberal MPs do you think were secretly hoping, we got to look tough on this, but I sure hope Jack Layton bails us out and votes with the government so we don't have to go to an election now?
Yeah, you're right, Steve. Well put. They wouldn't have minded had that happened. You know, as I say, a lot of them would have preferred at least to wait a few months now that the government is in seeming trouble over these abuse of power outbreaks.
Now, I know that when an election is called, I guess everybody thinks for the first few days the reason why it was called or who gets blamed for its being called is a very important thing. But then election campaigns are whatever, 30-plus days long, and by the time you get to the end, the reason why it was called in the beginning doesn't seem so important anymore. The only exception I can recall to that was 1990 in Ontario, where everybody said, early election called by David Peterson, people will be upset for a few days and then it won't matter. Can you see the reason why this election is being called as having more traction down the road?
No, I mean, that's the one exception you pointed that everyone points to, but one only exception. If you recall the 2008 federal election, the last one, I mean, Stephen Harper broke his own fixed election date rule to go into that campaign, and I can tell you there was a lot of debate behind the scenes in the PMO about this. Can we get away with this? You know, just going to the Governor General, breaking our own election law. I mean, this does not sound good. But as you suggest, you know, after the first week of the campaign, barely even that, everybody had moved on to talking about campaign issues, and the election call itself was no longer of paramount significance.
Those of us who were around 20 years ago in Ontario maybe read too many lessons into that 1990 example. So basically you're telling us that was a one-off. The fact is, once the election's on, people get down to the issues and they don't worry after a few days about who called it or not. Is that fair to say?
Exactly, exactly.
Okay, gotcha. Let me move into, I guess we're going to broaden our discussion a bit here and talk a bit about your book. I read your book. I really enjoyed your book, Lawrence, and I want to talk about how the events of today kind of factor into the story you're trying to tell in that book, Stephen Harper's Politics of Control. And let me just read this excerpt of your book as we get started here. Harper had demonstrated he could just be as pragmatic as ideological. He displayed different shades of conservatism at different times, depending on the circumstances he faced. The important connection was where he was moored, and it could hardly be said that this place was imbued with democratic ideals, but rather with monocratic, domineering tendencies. As you look at that template over which you see this governing party, how much pragmatism versus how much ideology do you think was in today's budget?
This was a political budget, a politically pragmatic budget. This was not an economic budget of significance in that there was not a lot of new stimulus for the economy, not a lot of restraint for the economy. It was basically a stay-the-course budget, and the purpose of it was at the political end to do what we discussed early, to trigger an election without having been seen to be triggering it. And this, you know, we speak again of the politics of control, and Stephen Harper, I think, had this plan mapped out quite a while ago, and maneuvered things quite nicely to fit that rubric. I mean, when you see, you mentioned about ideology versus pragmatism. You know, you recall, for example, that you know, this is a guy who had to go to the Keynesian route of all things to combat a recession, and had no hesitation in bringing all that stimulus spending to the economy, the type of thing that he had argued vociferously against in his thesis at the University of Alberta. And there's been all kinds of examples where politics surmounts ideology in terms of his priorities. He will play the middle card, the middle Canadian card, to a healthy degree. At the same time, you know, reaching out to his base with new jail building, law and order measures, new jet fighters, that kind of thing.
Would you say this budget, Lawrence, was any more conservative than any of the last ones?
No, I didn't see this as being a conservative budget. A conservative budget, Steve, would have addressed the deficit issue and the national debt issue much more aggressively. This one, you know, basically in the first year doesn't dig into it at all. It's very tame. The Prime Minister did not want to bring in an austerity budget at this time because electorally he realizes that does not pay. And if you, in fact, if you look at the polls and the priority issues in this fine land of ours, you see that deficit rates very low, deficit fighting rates very low in terms of Canadians' priorities.
You wrote in the book, and I'm going to quote you here, how the Prime Minister likes to turn the screws on his opponents. How does that show up in today's budget?
Well, he did it nicely. As mentioned, first of all, the leaks yesterday made it look like, yeah, boy, the Prime Minister is trying to meet the NDP more than halfway here. And those were the headlines this morning. And then in the budget itself, you know, he moved somewhat in their direction, but he knew well enough, having sat down with Jack Layton and knowing how strongly Jack Layton felt about these things, that this would not be enough for him. And so he maneuvered it so that it made it look like he was at least trying to meet the demands of the opposition.
Well, as much as you may not approve of the way he runs his government, or you think it's, you know, too tight-fisted or too controlling, the reality is, I think you also said that he's an extremely technically savvy guy. He's a very astute political observer. Was there anything in this budget today that you found emblematic of that savvy? Well,
that savvy is extraordinary. Let me say this first of all. He is a Prime Minister with in terms of an intimate knowledge of the issues that is probably second to none. You know, in researching the book, I talked to people in the PMO and the PCO, and the Privy Council office would send these long reports to him, and they would come back from Prime Minister with his handwriting in the margins. But not only that, but with corrections of spelling and corrections of grammar. He followed the issues that minutely. His grasp of the issues is extraordinary. At one priorities and planning meeting, you know, where the books, briefing books are stacked this high, he was in there, and the people came out shaking their heads, and one of them said to the other, he said, "My God, he's even read the annex items." He was so up on the files. So he brings this extraordinary amount of knowledge. He is not an economist, as he sometimes says. You know, just because you have a degree in economy or a master's in economics doesn't mean you're an economist. Just like, you know, if you have a degree in philosophy, you're not a philosopher. If you have a degree in history, you're not a historian. But, you know, he fancies this subject. He follows it, obviously, very closely. And when we talk of budgets and Jim Flaherty, we should talk more in terms of Stephen Harper, because his handwriting is in every line of it, I'm sure.
Well, let me ask you about one of those lines in the budget, and that is they continue to do something this time that they've done in years past, and that is offer very specific tax cuts to very targeted groups. You can name any number of groups in this one. For example, parents who want to put their kids in you know, piano lessons or art lessons or, you know, arts programmings. Why do they seem to like that approach so much?
Oh, because it's electoral targeting. They built a system in which they have defined in terms of demographics all the groups, you know, from retired firefighters to child violinists, you name it, and the support that these groups might want. Snowmobilers in Quebec, I was told, you know, they had a session once, what can we do in the PMO, what can we do for the snowmobilers in Quebec? And they put these graphs on the wall and pictures and representing different age groups, and here's the programs we have for everything minutely worked out. And so those items we see today, specific targeting, financial help for certain groups, were the ones that Stephen Harper felt he could needed to be exploited electorally with this kind of funding. The science is so minutely organized, it is really impressive, and of course you can extend that to, you know, his whole fundraising system, which is so superior to the Liberals and the other party. The whole organization of his war room, of his campaigns in the past, superior. This is a guy who knows how to run a machine.
In which case, Lawrence, last minute here, let me try one more thing. You've acknowledged he is a strategically brilliant thinker, the Prime Minister. You've acknowledged that technically he's a very savvy guy. You've just basically said that these targeted tax cuts are very smart politics and vote getters. Question, if you're the opposition, was this the right budget and the right time at which to bring down this government?
Not an ideal time, Steve, but they do have a little momentum due to the growing list of abuse of power, semi-scandals out there. The Prime Minister is so pathologically partisan, he moves himself into these problems. You know, he almost lost the government 2 years ago in the coalition crisis over that ridiculous budget update speech he brought forward. And he brings trouble upon himself with this brutal degree of partisanship. He might be giving some hope to the opposition parties with that this time. I know Michael Ignatiev's dander is really up, and he's going to be, as he says, trying to give Mr. Harper some of his own medicine in the coming campaign in terms of attack politics.
Having said that, if you were about to head out onto the hustings, whose chair would you like to be in tonight?
Well, certainly the momentum is with the Conservative Party. I think the Canadian people are, you know, people don't pay that much attention to politics and these shenanigans that have gone on here. They look at the big picture. The big picture favors the Conservative Party at the moment. However, you know, Michael Ignatieff is not known to the public because he's never been focused on. The opportunity for him is in an election campaign. The Liberal Party feels that with his low expectations, that he has a chance of scoring highly because he's become a more impressive performer on the opposition benches with time.
Gotcha. Lawrence, speaking of time, that's ours. Really grateful you could come on TVO with us tonight. Thanks so much.
It was my pleasure, Steve. Thank you.
Lawrence Martin, columnist for the Globe and Mail, author of Harperland, The Politics of Control.